On April 10th, 1912, the RMS Titanic slipped its moorings and sailed into history. But this wasn't just a ship. It was a monument to an age. We're talking almost 900 feet long, 25 stories high, the largest moving object ever built by human hands. It was the absolute pinnacle of technology, of luxury, and of this powerful belief that humanity had finally, truly conquered nature. It was a modern marvel. But as we all know, this marvel was sailing toward a date with destiny that would change it from a symbol of progress into the ultimate cautionary tale. Wow. Just listen to that quote from the ship's own captain. It tells you everything, doesn't it? That's not just confidence. That is a deep, unshakable faith in technology. It's hubris. And honestly, it's the real starting point for understanding how everything went so catastrophically wrong. It's like the very idea of a major disaster was something they believed they had engineered right out of existence. Now, just let that number sink in for a second. 2 hours and 40 minutes. That's it. From the moment the lookout spotted the iceberg to the moment the stern slipped beneath the waves. Gone. Keep in mind, the builders claimed this ship could stay afloat for 2, maybe even 3 days after the worst possible collision. So what happened wasn't just a tragedy, it was a total violation of the ship's fundamental promise. The speed of it all is just mind-boggling. And that right there is our central question. How did this happen? Because this was never a simple accident. This was a complete and total system failure. See, the story of the Titanic isn't about one thing going wrong. It's the story of everything going wrong, all at once. It's a complex puzzle, and to piece it together, we have to look way, way beyond just the iceberg. All right, so here's our game plan for this deep dive. We're going to start with how the unsinkable sank and introduce a really cool model to help us understand it all. Then we'll look at the literal flaws forged in steel. After that, we'll zoom out and see how a culture of complacency really set the stage. Then we'll look at the aftermath, how they started plugging the holes in maritime safety. And finally, we'll unpack the huge legacy of the Titanic. So, to really get to the bottom of this, we can't just blame the iceberg. That's too easy. We need a way to see how the whole system fell apart. And for that, we're going to use a fantastic mental model called the Swiss cheese model. And I love this because it's so simple, yet so powerful. Picture this. Every layer of safety, the ship's design, the regulations, the crew training, all of it, is a slice of Swiss cheese. Now, naturally, every slice has some holes. Those holes are weaknesses, right? Flaws, potential failures. On any normal day, a hazard hits a slice and gets blocked. But when all the holes in all the different slices just happen to line up perfectly, a hazard can pass straight through and you get a catastrophe. And the model gets even better because it breaks these failures into 2 types. On the right, you've got your active failures. That's the sharp end, the obvious stuff. An error made by someone on the front lines, like the crew on the bridge that night. But here's the key. To really understand why those active failures happened, you've got to look to the left, to the latent failures. This is the blunt end. These are the hidden flaws, the dormant holes that were created by designers, by managers, by regulators, sometimes years before the ship even sailed. These latent failures set the traps that made the active failures at the sharp end almost inevitable. So, using our model, let's start at that blunt end with those latent failures. We're going to begin at the very top, the culture of complacency. This is all about the mindset, the organizational decisions that punched the first, and maybe the biggest, holes in our Swiss cheese long before the Titanic ever saw the ocean. Okay, this one just lays the problem bare. Look at those numbers. You've got more than 2,200 people on that ship, but only enough lifeboat seats for about 1,178. So let's be clear, even with a flawless, perfect evacuation, nearly half the people on board were doomed from the second the ship left port. But here is the absolute kicker. The law only required about 990 seats, so the Titanic actually exceeded the legal requirement. The system itself was broken. The safety regulations were ancient, based on a formula for much smaller ships, and nobody had bothered to update them for these new giants. So legally, they were fine. In reality, it was a floating death trap. So you're probably wondering, why weren't there more lifeboats if there was clearly space? Well, this quote is just devastating. The original design could handle 2 full rows of lifeboats, but a second row was never even installed. Why? To make the first-class promenade deck look less cluttered, to make it more aesthetically pleasing. Let that sink in. It was a conscious choice. prioritizing the visual appeal for the wealthiest passengers over the literal survival of everyone on the ship. That is a textbook latent failure, a decision made in a comfortable office years earlier that had fatal consequences in the freezing North Atlantic. And here's another massive latent failure: the entire communication system. The ship's brand new, powerful wireless radio was basically seen as a fun toy for rich passengers to send telegrams back home, not a critical safety tool. And get this, the wireless operators, they didn't even work for the Titanic. They worked for the Marconi Company, and their main job was to make money sending those passenger messages. So when critical ice warnings started flooding in from other ships, they just got lost in the shuffle. The senior operator, Jack Phillips, was so swamped that when a nearby ship, the SS Californian, tried to send yet another urgent warning about being stopped in ice, he famously shot back, "Shut up, I am busy." The warnings were all there, but the system just wasn't designed to listen. Okay, so let's peel back another layer of our Swiss cheese. We're moving from the culture in the boardroom down to the very molecules of the ship itself. The flaws weren't just in the plans, they were literally forged into the steel and hammered into the rivets. Decades later, when explorers finally brought pieces of the Titanic's hull up from the deep, this is what scientists saw. The steel hadn't bent or dented on impact like you'd expect. It had shattered, like broken china. This was the first huge clue that the unsinkable ship had a fundamental, invisible weakness built right into its bones. And this right here shows you that weakness perfectly. Scientists ran something called a Sharpie test. They took a piece of the recovered hull, chilled it down to the exact temperature of the water that night, and hit it with a weighted pendulum. The Titanic's steel shattered with a sharp ping. But when they did the same exact test on a piece of modern ship steel, it just bent into a V with a dull thud. It absorbed the impact. So what does this mean? In plain English, the very steel used to build the ship became incredibly fragile and brittle in the icy waters it was designed to sail through. The same thing happened with the 3 million iron rivets holding it all together. They were made of lower quality iron that also likely popped clean off on impact. Now, let's talk about the ship's most famous safety feature, those so-called watertight compartments. The idea was genius. The ship could supposedly stay afloat even if the first 4 compartments were totally flooded. They planned for a head-on collision, and it would have survived that. But there was a fatal design flaw. The walls between the compartments, the bulkheads, they didn't go all the way up to the main deck. They stopped a few feet above the waterline. Think of it like an ice cube tray. You can fill up one section, but if you keep pouring, the water just spills over the top into the next one. And here it is, the ultimate, most tragic irony of the Titanic's design. The iceberg didn't tear a huge gash in the side like in the movies. It bumped and scraped along the hull, popping rivets and opening seams along the first 6 compartments. As those filled with water, the bow got heavier and heavier, pulling the front of the ship down. And as soon as the bow dipped low enough, the water just started spilling over the top of one bulkhead into the next and then the next, like a waterfall. The very safety feature that was meant to save the ship actually made it sink faster by concentrating all that weight in the front. Without them, the ship might have settled on a more even keel and stayed afloat for hours longer, plenty of time for help to arrive. Okay, so now we move from the blunt end to the sharp end. We're going to the night of April 14th, 1912. All those latent failures we talked about, the complacency, the missing lifeboats, the ignored warnings, the brittle steel, the flawed compartments, they're all just lying there, dormant, waiting in the dark. All it's going to take is a few final active errors for every single one of those holes in the Swiss cheese to line up perfectly. Let's start with maybe the most unbelievable what-if in the whole story. On a calm, moonless night, the 2 lookouts in the crow's nest were staring into a black ocean without binoculars. Why? Because the key to the locker where the binoculars were kept was sitting in the pocket of an officer who had been reassigned off the ship right before it sailed. In the last-minute shuffle, he just forgot to hand over the key. It is such a tiny human mistake, but it left the ship effectively blind. And don't just take my word for it. This is the chilling testimony from Fred Fleet, the man who actually spotted the iceberg. His words are just a gut punch. They draw a straight line from that tiny latent failure, the forgotten key, to the ultimate active failure of not seeing the danger in time. That one small oversight, combined with the ship's reckless speed in a known ice field, was the final trigger. And then, as if it couldn't get any worse, there was the SS Californian. This ship was stopped for the night, less than 20 miles away, literally sitting in the same ice field. Its officers saw the Titanic firing distress rockets. They saw them, but they were confused. The rockets were white, And back then, there was no universal standard. Some shipping lines used rockets just to signal to each other, thinking it was just some company signals. And with their own radio operator fast asleep, they did nothing. Help was right there on the horizon, but a failure in communication protocols and a fatal moment of indecision meant they just watched as the disaster unfolded. And this timeline just shows you the terrifying speed of the end. At 11:40, impact. Just 20 minutes later, at midnight, the fatal design flaw of the compartments is already kicking in. By 2 a.m., the massive propellers are completely out of the water, a point of no return. And then, in those final, horrific moments, the unbelievable stress on the hull becomes too much. The ship literally breaks in half. The bow rips away, and the stern rises almost straight up into the air before its final, horrifying plunge into the abyss. The loss of more than 1,500 people sent an absolute shockwave around the world. It completely shattered that illusion of technological perfection. In the aftermath, investigations on both sides of the Atlantic were launched to figure out what went wrong and, more importantly, how to make sure this never, ever happened again. It was time to find every one of those holes in the Swiss cheese and plug them for good. And this is what they did. The very first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, was created. The lifeboat problem? Fixed. From then on, enough lifeboats for every single person on board became the law. The ignored radio messages? Fixed. A 24-hour radio watch became mandatory. The iceberg hazard? The International Ice Patrol was formed, and they still track icebergs to this day. And the confusion over the rockets? Fixed. Red rockets now mean one thing and one thing only: distress. Every single new rule was a direct response to a failure that doomed the Titanic. When you look at it through this lens, you realize that the Titanic wasn't sunk by an iceberg. Not really. It was sunk by a culture of overconfidence, by outdated rules, by aesthetics winning out over safety, by brittle steel, and by a forgotten key. It was sunk by dozens of tiny, seemingly unrelated failures that all lined up on one fateful night. And that's the real lesson here, the one that sticks with you. Big disasters are rarely one single event. They are systems waiting to fail. And it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the hidden holes, the latent failures in the complex systems that we all depend on every single day?